Sleet struck Susan MacDonald's face like thrown salt while she stood beside the hired carriage in the market square outside York, one hand braced against a trunk that had already soaked through her glove. Dawn had not properly broken. The sky was a low sheet of iron. Mud pooled in the ruts between wagons and froze in a skin at the edges, then broke again under cartwheels. She had been awake since the middle of the night, packing Lady Hawthorne's silk gowns in tissue, pinning fresh lace where old lace had torn, pressing ribbons with the back of a warming pan gone nearly cold. Lye from the laundry had split the skin at her knuckles. The cuts had opened again while she fastened buckles in the dark. Now the sleet found every crack. Her fingers burned and then went numb, and then burned again. A maid from the inn came out carrying parcels that Susan herself had tied, and passed them to the footman as if they had appeared by magic. No one looked at Susan when each parcel was named and stacked. No one thanked her when the weight shifted and she put her shoulder against the side to steady it. Her shoes were damp through at the toe. The leather had thinned where the sole had been patched twice. Cold water pressed against her stockings and did not leave. Across the square a butcher's boy tore bread and ate it standing. The smell reached her, warm yeast and fat and pepper, and her stomach cramped so sharply that she had to lock her jaw to keep her breath quiet. Supper had been withheld the previous night for walking too slowly up the back stair with a crate of glass. Lady Hawthorne had said discipline preserved standards. Susan had said nothing because speech cost strength, and strength had to be saved for lifting, carrying, mending, accounting, enduring. Two women under the draper's awning watched while Lady Hawthorne's maid checked the list aloud in a crisp, performative voice meant to carry. The green mantle, the embroidered chemise, the coral fan with silver clasp. She paused at Susan and then looked away, as one might look at a post. A gentleman waiting for his horse muttered to another, not quietly enough, "The stepdaughter, is it? Plain little thing. Too sharp in the eyes." His companion followed his glance and frowned, as if annoyed by the first verdict. Susan heard both remarks. She had heard versions of them for 3 years. Too dark-haired, too thin, too severe, too old at 22 for a fortune already thinned by marriage settlements she had not signed, and debts she had never seen before they appeared in her own careful hand. Plain, they called her, when what they meant was not decorative enough to protect and not powerful enough to punish. She kept her chin level and watched the steam from the horses rise in pale plumes. Her face in the carriage glass looked almost colourless in the half-light, cheekbones more pronounced from missed meals, mouth set in a line she could not soften this morning. Her eyes were large and dark and wakeful despite the hour. She knew what strangers saw when they looked twice. She also knew what that second glance could not buy her. Dignity was not coin. Grace did not settle accounts. In this square she was the unpaid burden Lady Hawthorne named in drawing-rooms, the useful shadow who lifted trunks and carried blame and left no signature in public memory. She had learned to stand where people expected furniture and still remain human in the centre of herself. Lady Hawthorne arrived wrapped in violet silk that whispered as she walked, lavender water preceding her like a herald. Her gloves were pearl grey. Her veil was pinned with jet. She did not greet Susan. She spoke to the coachman, to the maid, to the man minding the post horses, and then, with mild annoyance sharpened for witnesses, she spoke about Susan. "Do keep her out of sight when we change at the river road. My husband left me many expenses. She is the most persistent of them." A merchant's wife near the cider stall gave a brief, startled look, and then looked down at her own basket. No one contradicted a lady in silk at dawn. Susan shifted the final valise into place, tied the strap twice, and wiped her wet hand on her apron, where no one would notice the blood from a reopened cut. Lady Harthorn's gaze moved over her as one inspects damaged china. If she faints, do not stop the carriage. She mistakes inconvenience for suffering. Susan bent, not from obedience, but to tighten a wheel brace that had come loose, the iron bit into her palm. She tasted metal in her mouth from biting back a reply. Her father had taught her better than insolence squandered on people who profited by her reaction. He had taught her columns and balance sheets, taught her to set each figure in ink so clean that any fraud would show itself by pressure alone. He had taught her Virgil in the quiet after supper, when candles burned low and the house still felt like home. Then he had died in one winter week, and her mother had remarried in one spring season, and law had flowed around signatures like water around stone. By the second week after that wedding, keys had moved from one ring to another. By the end of that first year, Susan's place at table had become uncertain. By the end of the second, it had vanished except when guests needed a cautionary object. Now, 3 years on, she travelled with the household as a convenience unacknowledged on invitations but essential to every smooth arrival. When the last strap was knotted and checked, she climbed to the rear platform to secure hat boxes that had to remain upright. Her shoulders ached from lifting. Her wrists throbbed. The cold found the damp seam at her spine and settled there. Inside the carriage, Lady Harthorn and her daughters arranged skirts over lap rugs and complained about draughts while Susan tightened buckles in sleet. One stepsister laughed when a gust blew Susan's shawl loose and exposed the mended elbow of her dress. "She always appears half assembled," she said. "Perhaps if she moved with intention her stitches would hold." Susan retied the shawl without answering. There was no defence against ridicule that did not become more ridicule. She had tested that theorem often enough. A porter she did not know passed her a coil of twine without being asked, his face unreadable, and for one brief moment she felt the dangerous rise of gratitude. It was dangerous because it reminded her what ordinary kindness cost so little, and how rarely it was offered where rank could forbid it. She knelt to secure a crate of preserved fruit and thought of the attic chest beneath her narrow bed. Inside, under 2 folded shifts and a cracked comb, lay the one thing Lady Harthorn had not found, a small account book bound in dark calf, the edges worn from handling. In it, Susan had copied every altered rent roll, every false debt entry, every diverted dowry line she had been ordered to transcribe on official sheets. She had added dates. She had marked witnesses when she could. She had recorded her own withheld wages as zeros where wages should have stood. She had written, once only, supper denied for walking too slowly, because numbers could carry humiliation more faithfully than tears. She did not keep the book as vengeance. She kept it because memory could be bullied and ink could not. Endurance without record felt too much like consent. A church bell struck 6 through the wet air, and the market answered with movement. Shutters lifted, carts rolled, geese cried in wicker crates, men called prices into the grey. Susan climbed down from the rear step and waited for the order to mount the outside bench, where wind would strike hardest. Her knees trembled once, then steadied. Hunger had become a rhythm she knew. Cold had become a second skin. She could map the morning by pain alone. Split knuckles, wet feet, hollow stomach, neck tight from balancing weight that never appeared in any account. Lady Harthorn's voice came from within the carriage, dulled by velvet and glass. "If she slows us again, leave her at the next posting in." One daughter answered with lazy cruelty, "Who would notice?" Susan set her hand on the carriage door to brace herself against the sway as a horse stamped. She did not bow her head. She looked across the square where the first true light had begun to gather behind the chapel roof, pale and thin but stubborn. Her father had once told her that numbers were a moral language. They revealed who took, who paid, who lied, who starved while others feasted. In this hour she had no advocate, no invitation, no coin of her own. She had cold in her bones and sleet in her lashes, and work waiting at every mile. Yet, beneath the ache, beneath the insult delivered as routine, something remained intact and watchful. She had her memory. She had her hand. She had the ledger hidden where no silk rustle could reach. The coachman snapped the reins. Wheels lurched in mud. Susan climbed to the bench as the carriage jolted forward, and the square slid behind her in grey, in noise, in witness. The carriage struck the first deep rut beyond the square, and pitched hard to the left, dragging Susan's shoulder against the iron rail of the outside bench. Wet leather creaked, harness chains snapped taut, then slackened. Wind knifed under her shawl and settled between her shoulder blades, where the dress was still damp from sleet. Behind the glass, she could hear Lady Hawthorn complaining that the jolting would bruise peaches packed for luncheon, as if fruit possessed a rank denied to living people. Susan braced her boots against the footboard and held fast while York fell away in greying fields and stripped hedges. Every jolt travelled through her wrists, already swollen at the joints. Every mile pulled another thread from her strength. Yet the movement itself unlocked memory the way cold unlocked pain. Her father had once taken this same road at dawn to inspect tenants' roofs after a storm, and he had lifted her onto the seat beside him, wrapped in his old greatcoat that smelled of wool, ink, and wood smoke. "Accounts are not merely figures," he had told her when she was 12 and solemn with the importance of a sharpened quill. "They are promises made visible." She had repeated the sentence until she could write it without blotting. In winter evenings he read Virgil by candlelight and made her scan each line aloud until her tongue learned the cadence. In summer he set household ledgers before her, not because he lacked clerks, but because he trusted her hand. She could still feel the smooth bone handle of his letter opener under her thumb, still see how he ruled columns with a light pressure that never tore the page. Then illness came in January, swift as a door slammed in wind. By Candlemas he was dead, the house muffled in black crape and formal condolences, and men who had laughed with him in this very yard lowered their voices to discuss settlements over his coffin, as though grief were a scheduling inconvenience. Her mother had wept in the chapel. Susan had stood upright through the service, fingers locked so tightly in her gloves that her nails cut crescents in her palms. She had believed then that the worst had happened and would therefore pass. She had not yet learned that loss could be followed by administration, and administration by dispossession, all of it legal, all of it tidy, all of it signed. By late spring of that same year, her stepmother remarried Mr. Hawthorn, a man older than her father, and eager for acreage he had never earned. The wedding breakfast had been generous. The vows had been said beneath white flowers paid for from MacDonald Rents. Within a fortnight, the key ring changed hands. Within a month, correspondence from their solicitor arrived addressed to Mr. Hawthorn as Master. Susan remembered the exact rustle of the paper because she had opened and logged each letter under instruction, her own surname staring up at her in a clerk's neat script while authority migrated elsewhere. She remembered the first time Lady Hawthorn corrected a servant in Susan's hearing. "Miss MacDonald has no authority to order coal for the West Nursery. Ask me." It was said with a smile and a touch on the maid's sleeve, gentle enough to pass for etiquette. The second correction came without the smile. The third came before guests. By midsummer, Susan no longer sat at the head sideboard where her father had once asked her opinion on rents. She stood behind chairs and poured wine for strangers who mistook her for hired help, and thanked Lady Harthorn for the efficient management of a house they had not seen before. Mrs. Davies, softer by temperament and already tired by then, kept saying, "It is temporary. We must keep peace," until saying it became her only defence, and then even that diminished into silence. Susan had tried once to object when a tenant widow was charged arrears she did not owe. Lady Harthorn's response had been silk over steel. "You confuse sentiment with arithmetic, child." When Susan produced the previous quarter's tally, precise and dated, Mr. Harthorn had glanced down, frowned at the discrepancy, and then passed the page back without comment. That was the afternoon she understood the household's true order. Fact might be admitted in private, but power would decide what fact could survive in public. By the first winter after the remarriage, meals were quietly reduced for Susan alone when she displeased them. By the second, her allowance had been suspended on grounds of economy, while new draperies appeared in every drawing-room. By the third, Lady Harthorn referred to her in mixed company as "my husband's unfortunate responsibility," and no one corrected the lie that Susan consumed charity instead of generating it through unpaid labour. The daughters learned quickly, as children of comfort always learned when cruelty was modelled as refinement. They took first what could be taken without witnesses: ribbons from Susan's work-basket, pins from her mending tin, the blue wool shawl her father had brought from Edinburgh. Then they took what required audacity. The elder daughter claimed Susan's mother-of-pearl comb because it suited her hair better. The younger took a pair of half boots left outside Susan's door after repair, and laughed when Susan searched for them in the rain. "Perhaps the house swallowed them," she said, while wearing them at dinner under a hem deliberately lifted. Dresses followed. Lady Harthorn ordered Susan to alter old gowns for charity parcels, and then redirected the best pieces to her daughter's trunks, leaving Susan with cast-offs cut to flatter other bodies. When Susan's bodice split at the seam carrying coal up the back stairs, she was reprimanded for untidiness in front of visiting ladies who whispered behind fans and called her plain as if plainness were a fault of character. It was not merely vanity they stripped from her. It was position, minute by minute, rule by rule. She had once received calls in the small morning room where her father kept maps. Now she was sent through side entrances with parcels, instructed to wait in passages while correspondence was discussed, told to stand behind screens during musicales, lest she distract with her melancholy aspect. Even her name thinned. In the kitchen she became Miss Susan, if Mrs. Davies remembered kindness. In the hall she became Girl. In the carriage she became Her. Present cold pressed those years into her bones as surely as the sleet pressed through wool. A branch lashed her cheek when they rounded a bend too near the hedge. The sting brought water to her eyes. She blinked it away at once. Through the panel behind her came the younger daughter's voice, bright and careless. "Must she ride outside all the way to the river? She looks ghastly." Lady Harthorn answered without lowering her tone. "If she wishes warmth, she may earn usefulness." Susan shifted her grip on the rail and faced forward. Endurance had become muscle memory. So had the discipline of not replying where reply would be used as proof of madness, ingratitude, instability, any label convenient enough to erase the next objection. Debts were the final instrument, dull and devastating. After Mr. Harthorn died of an apoplexy 18 months into the marriage, Lady Harthorn did not lose influence. She consolidated it. Mourning ribbons appeared. Lawyers arrived. New obligations surfaced from drawers no one had opened before. Repair loans, gaming notes in unfamiliar hands, advances against rents not yet due. Susan was ordered to copy each claim into the estate book for clarity, then to prepare fair versions for signature. The sums were wrong in patterns that would have escaped any casual eye but not hers. Duplicate carriage costs entered under separate months, tenant remittances shaved by identical percentages, dowry funds transferred to maintenance accounts and then reclassified as discretionary expenditure. She marked each irregularity first in her head, then in the hidden calf-bound ledger by candlelight after midnight, using tiny script to save paper and conceal intent. She recorded dates, initials, ink colour, pressure differences where signatures were traced. She recorded missed payments owed to her under her father's marriage settlement. She recorded humiliations as numbers because numbers could be admitted where pain would be mocked. 1 supper denied, 2 days on tea and crusts, 6 hours on her feet mending gloves for a ball she could not attend, 1 pair of shoes past repair and still required for travel. The account became a second pulse. It steadied her when hunger narrowed her vision. It reminded her that she was not forgetful, not hysterical, not the burden they described. She was a witness with arithmetic on her side. A mile marker flashed by through sleet, half obscured by mud. The coachman shouted at the lead pair and drew them down a narrow incline toward the river road, where grey water moved under a low sky like beaten metal. Susan flexed her fingers once, wincing as cracked skin reopened at the knuckles, and tucked her hand beneath the edge of her apron to hide the blood. She carried no weapon, no patron, no certainty beyond the next stop. She carried memory disciplined into ink. That, for now, was enough to keep her spine straight on the outside bench while the carriage rolled on. By the time the River Toll House came into view through sleet and low fog, Susan could no longer feel the tips of her fingers. The road narrowed between alder trees black with rain. Ahead, 2 public coaches and a private curricle had already drawn up near the transfer yard, where travellers changed horses before the bridge. Men shouted over one another in wet wool and steam. A drover drove geese off the paving stones with a stick. Bells on harness rang thinly in the cold. For 1 brief minute, the crush of strangers offered a rough kind of shelter, because in a crowd, Lady Hawthorne's gaze could not rest on Susan alone. She climbed down when the coachman jerked his head, boots sinking in churned mud, and reached for the rear latch with hands that shook from cold and hunger both. A post-horse screamed. Metal struck stone. The sound cracked the morning open. The grey gelding hitched to the curricle reared sideways as a wagon wheel clipped its flank. Its driver hauled the reins too late. The curricle slewed. 1 wheel struck the curbstone at an angle and bounced. A slight young gentleman in a fine dark greatcoat perched on the side step, while a groom adjusted straps, lost his hold, and went down hard against the timber post of the toll gate. The impact threw his hat into the muck and left him folded on 1 knee, stunned and gasping. At the same instant, the taller man beside him was pitched forward, shoulder first, into mud and broken gravel. He rose at once too quickly, and the left arm of his coat hung wrong, sleeve twisting as if the joint beneath had slipped. His face was pale beneath rain and road dirt. A scar, old and tight, ran from the edge of his jaw toward his ear and whitened when his teeth clenched. "Stand back!" The command cut through the yard like a whip crack. Porters halted. A woman cried out and then covered her mouth. Susan did not stand back. She was already moving. She reached the young gentleman first, dropped to her knees in mud that soaked her skirt through, and set both hands to his head where skin had split along the hairline. Blood was not heavy, but it ran fast in the rain, blinding him in 1 eye. "Look at me," she said, voice low and exact. the way her father had once spoken to a tenant child after a fall from a stile. "Keep your eyes on me. Breathe through your nose. Do not try to rise." He obeyed without argument, blinking hard, lips bloodless from shock. Her petticoat hem tore under her hands with one sharp rip. She folded linen into a thick pad and pressed it to the cut. The tall stranger reached them in 2 strides despite the ruined arm, then stopped as if the world had narrowed to her hands and the boy's breathing. Rain struck all 3 of them. Cartwheels rattled past the far gate. No one else came closer. They were watching the title in his coat and the authority in his posture, waiting to be told what to do. Susan could not spare a glance, upward yet. "He may retch," she said to the stranger, still pressing steady pressure. "If he does, turn him to his side. Keep him warm. Do you hear me?" The man's eyes fixed on her face with a cold intensity that felt like being measured against steel. "I hear you!" His voice was roughened by pain and command both. Behind them, a groom stammered apologies about the shying horse. Someone shouted for a surgeon. The young gentleman gripped Susan's sleeve with wet fingers and whispered, "It burns!" She bent closer, so he did not need to raise his voice. "That is good. Burning means you are awake." Her own knees trembled under her weight. Mud seeped through the seams of her shoes and turned her toes numb. The pressure in her empty stomach rolled and tightened, but her hands stayed precise. She shifted the bandage, checked his pupils as best she could in grey light, and counted his breaths under it all, a quiet rhythm against the chaos of shouting men and stamping horses. The tall stranger crouched opposite her, favouring his left side without complaint. Rain tracked down his temples. He looked less at the boy than at Susan, as though recognition were forcing itself through pain and disbelief and old memory. A footman pushed through the ring at last with a leather medical case. The stranger did not look up. "Late," he said. One word, flat as stone. The footman swallowed and dropped to one knee. Susan handed over pressure only when she felt steady fingers take the cloth exactly where hers had been. She rose too fast. The yard tilted. Her vision narrowed to white at the edges for a breath, and then returned in a hard rush. The tall man stood as well, and for a second they were close enough that she felt the heat of his body against the sleet-chilled air, close enough to see that his eyes were the colour of storm water over slate, close enough to know him before anyone spoke his name. Alistair Vale, Duke of Ravensmere, looked at her as if struck a second time. She had seen him once from far closer than propriety allowed, 3 years earlier in a panelled chamber in York, where petitioners waited in a line that smelled of wet wool and fear. She had brought papers then, copies of settlement clauses and signatures she did not trust, and she had asked for legal protection before the second transfer could be filed against her portion. He had stood near the hearth in a dark coat and white cravat, broad-shouldered and motionless, while 2 men of his circle dismissed her case in smooth voices. A merchant's daughter, domestic confusion, exaggeration born of female agitation. The Duke had listened. He had not asked her a single question. He had said, "This is not a matter for my intervention." Then he had turned away to receive a magistrate. She had walked out with her papers shaking in her hand and learned how swiftly rank could make injustice respectable. Now he stood in mud and rain with one arm likely dislocated, and she could not decide which pain was sharper, the old humiliation or the present fact that he was watching her as if he had seen nothing else in the yard. His gaze dropped to her hands first, raw knuckles, split skin reopened and threaded with pink in rainwater, then to the tremor at her wrists. She could not hide any longer. Then to the hollow at the base of her throat above a dress mended too many times. He spoke without courtesy and without softness. Your hands are raw. You're shaking. You have not eaten." The words struck harder than accusation, because they were exact. No one named such things aloud. Not in public. Not ever. Susan lifted her chin. "Your arm is hanging out of place, Your Grace." "Answer me!" "I have answered." He stared at her one measured second longer, jaw tightening around whatever anger he chose not to spend on her. Then he turned, voice cutting through rain and clamour. "Mr. Pritchard, attend Miss MacDonald first." The surgeon, kneeling by the young gentleman, froze with his case open. "Your Grace, your shoulder first." The single word landed like a gavel. The surgeon obeyed at once, rising and crossing to Susan with reluctant haste, while two grooms supported the Duke's injured side, whether he wanted help or not. She stepped back, out of reach. "I do not require treatment." The Duke did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "Hold still." "I can stand." "You are already swaying." Heat climbed her throat despite the cold. He was right, and she despised him for being right in front of strangers who had watched her kneel in mud. "I will not be handled like a child." His expression did not change. "Then stand like a woman and let him clean those hands." Around them, travellers pretended not to listen and listened to every syllable. The young gentleman on the crate had gone pale but alert under fresh bandages, watching this exchange with dazed intensity. Susan gave one short nod to the surgeon, not to the Duke, and held out her hands. Spirits stung open skin like fire. She did not flinch. She would not give Lady Harthorn the spectacle of a fainting fit if her carriage curtains opened now. They opened. Lavender reached the yard before Lady Harthorn did. Silk rustled beneath the dark mantle as she swept from the carriage step, daughters at her heels and outrage carefully arranged on her face for witnesses. She took in the mud on Susan's skirt, the surgeon at Susan's side, the Duke standing rigid with one shoulder displaced, and she altered her expression in a blink to injured propriety. "Your Grace," she said, curtsying shallowly in wet ground, "my stepdaughter has always been prone to scenes. I beg you do not let her distress your party further." Susan's pulse hammered once against her ribs. Not fear this time. Recognition of the old pattern arriving on schedule, polished and lethal. The Duke turned his head toward Lady Harthorn with glacial precision. Rain ran from his dark hair onto his collar. "Your stepdaughter just kept my ward conscious while your footman watched." Lady Harthorn's smile thinned. "She has a talent for appearing useful when gentlemen are present." One of the daughters gave a soft laugh, and then stopped when the Duke looked at her. He took one step toward Lady Harthorn, slight from pain but unmistakably deliberate. "Name yourself." She blinked, startled by the order. "Lady Harthorn, of MacDonald House." "Then hear me clearly, Lady Harthorn. You will address Miss MacDonald with respect while you stand in my sight." Silence spread in a ring around them. Even the drover at the gate stopped shouting. Lady Harthorn recovered quickly, colour high under powder. "Your Grace mistakes family discipline for cruelty. The girl is unstable. She invents injuries when corrected." Susan's fingers curled in her skirts. She kept her voice level. "I invent nothing." Lady Harthorn's eyes flashed, warning sharpened to a blade only Susan could read. "Be quiet." The Duke answered before Susan could. "Not today." The surgeon finished binding Susan's palms with clean linen and moved at last to the Duke's shoulder. Ravensmere allowed the manipulation in silence, face hard as carved stone, while the joint slipped back with a muted click that made nearby men wince. He did not. When it was done, he flexed his hand once and looked again at Susan, not at her stepmother, not at the crowd. You will ride under my protection to the next posting house. Floodwater has taken the lower road. No carriage leaves alone." Lady Harthorn drew breath to object. He cut across her without turning his head. "This is not a request." Susan felt every gaze in the yard swing between silk and mud, title and hunger, command and endurance. 3 years earlier he had believed what men said of her and dismissed her with a phrase. Now he was ordering the road around her as if the world could be corrected by authority belatedly used. She ought to have felt relief. What she felt was fury, threaded with an unwilling spark of gratitude, both too sharp to separate. Rain ran off the toll house roof in steady sheets. The river beyond the bridge had risen brown and fast, carrying branches and torn reeds downstream. Susan looked once at the young gentleman, now wrapped in a blanket and breathing evenly, then back at the Duke's unreadable face. "I will ride," she said, each word clean as ink on ruled paper. "But I do not belong to your protection, Your Grace." His eyes held hers, storm-dark and unblinking. "We shall discuss what belongs to whom on the road." The words hung between them in rain and horse steam, too intimate for a yard full of strangers, and too blunt to mistake for courtesy. Susan held his gaze one heartbeat longer than was wise, then turned from him to the boy on the crate, because the child needed water and warmth and not another contest of rank. She took the tin cup a groom offered, lifted it to the boy's mouth and steadied his wrist when his fingers shook. "What is your name?" she asked. He swallowed with care, as if each movement surprised him. "Edmund Hale." "Can you tell me where you are, Master Edmund?" "At the River Toll House, on the York Road." He shut his eyes against a wave of pain, then opened them again. "My head is splitting." "That is expected. Stay awake while we travel. Do not sleep until I say." The Duke had moved close enough that she felt him there, a pressure like weather against skin. "He obeys you." "He is sensible," she said, still watching Edmund's pupils in the grey light. "That is not the same thing." A flicker crossed the Duke's face. Not quite a smile. Gone at once. He turned to his men. "Harness my travelling coach. Miss MacDonald rides within." Lady Harthorn stepped forward, silk darkened at the hem by mud. "She rides with me." Ravensmere did not glance at her. "No, it would be improper. It would be safer," he said. "Floodwater has taken the low crossing. I will not repeat myself." Susan rose, knees stiff from cold. Knees stiff. She did not thank him. Gratitude offered in public would become a debt collected in private, and she had lived too long on the wrong side of such arithmetic. She looked to Lady Harthorn and saw the thin, bright fury under powder and lavender. "Get in," her stepmother whispered, smile fixed for onlookers. "Say nothing. You have done enough harm for one morning." Susan met that smile with calm she did not feel. "I have done what was needed." Lady Harthorn's hand closed over Susan's bandaged wrist with painful precision, hidden beneath mantle folds. "You will sign whatever statement I place before you tonight. You will say the coachman drove drunk and struck us. You will say you saw it clearly." The old instinct to nod and survive rose, sharp and automatic. She crushed it. "I will not lie," Susan said, low enough that only Lady Harthorn heard. Lady Harthorn released her at once, expression smoothing to gracious concern as the Duke turned back toward them. "She is overwrought, Your Grace. Grief has made her fanciful these 3 years." "Liar," he said. The single word landed softly and did more damage than shouting. Lady Harthorn went still. Ravensmere offered Susan his uninjured arm to assist her over a trench of churned mud toward his carriage. She ignored the arm and stepped across alone, catching the door frame with her good hand before she slipped. He watched her do it, jaw set, and followed without comment. Inside, the carriage smelled of wet wool, leather, and camphor from the surgeon's case. Edmund lay along the opposite seat under 2 blankets, face pale, lashes clumped with rain. Susan took the place beside him at once and braced one hand behind his neck to keep him upright as the wheels began to roll. Across from her, the Duke sat angled to protect his newly bound shoulder from jolts. The coach lurched forward into deep ruts, and rain drummed on the roof with relentless force. For several minutes no one spoke. Edmund's breathing rasped softly. Harness bells thinned and thickened with distance from the other vehicles in their party. Susan counted each rise and fall of the boy's chest and judged the rhythm against what she had seen at the yard. Still shallow, still regular, better than before. "Look at me, Edmund," she said when his eyelids drooped. "Tell me the alphabet backward from M." He made a face that would have been indignant if he had any colour to spend on indignation. "That is cruel." "It is useful," he began, stumbling at K and laughing weakly when he reached H twice. Susan corrected him, stern and gentle together, and kept him speaking until the worst of the shaking passed. Only then did she notice the Duke watching not her face but her hands on the child's blanket, the way she kept one thumb moving in small circles at Edmund's wrist to mark pulse without making a display of it. "Where did you learn that?" he asked. "My father taught tenants' children first aid in lambing season," she said. "Falls were common, pride more common." "Your father was a Mr. Ian MacDonald." It was not a question. She gave a short nod. "I remember him," the Duke said. She looked up sharply. "You remember him, yet you did not remember me." His gaze held steady. "I remembered you the moment you looked up in the rain." The carriage struck a stone and pitched. Edmund winced and clutched at Susan's sleeve. She bent closer to him, ending the exchange by simple necessity. The boy needed cool cloth at his neck. He needed someone who did not ask him to perform bravery for adult comfort. She dipped a handkerchief in water from the travel flask, wrung it, and laid it across his brow. By the time they reached the 1st mile gate beyond the river bend, sleet had turned to hard rain, and the fields on either side were half lake, half road. Water ran over the stones in quick brown sheets that carried straw, twigs, and one broken hen coop past the wheels. The convoy slowed to a crawl. Through the glass, Susan saw Lady Hawthorne's carriage rock behind them, one wheel nearly swallowed by a rut. A mounted outrider came alongside and shouted through the Duke's window, "Bridge at Thorpe is gone, Your Grace. Innkeeper at Blackthorn is taking travellers till flood drops." Ravensmere gave one clipped order. "Blackthorn," he glanced to Susan. "We shelter there tonight." She answered without lifting her eyes from Edmund. "Then we shelter." The road to Blackthorn Inn climbed through birch scrub and low stone walls, then narrowed between 2 flooded ditches where the horses had to pick each step. Dusk came early under rain clouds. By the time they reached the inn-yard, lamps were lit in the windows and stable boys were running in mud up to their ankles, shouting for dry straw and more hands. The common room was already crowded with stranded travellers steaming in damp coats. Ravensmere's title moved space around him like a blade through cloth. A private parlour was opened. A small chamber adjoining it was given over for Edmund to lie quiet. The surgeon left powders and instructions and went to set a farmer's broken wrist downstairs. Susan remained. Lady Hawthorne entered 10 minutes later with a tray she had not carried herself, broth, bread, and a folded sheet of paper sealed in red wax. Lavender fought with the smell of peat smoke and wet boots. She set the tray down by Edmund's bedside with theatrical tenderness, then looked to Susan. "Eat," she said sweetly. "You look feral." Susan had not eaten since a crust at noon the day before. Her stomach cramped so sharply at the broth's heat that her hand shook once over the spoon. She steadied it against the table edge and fed Edmund first, one careful swallow at a time. Lady Harthorn watched, smile rigid. "You may go now. I will sit with him." Edmund's fingers tightened around Susan's wrist under the blanket. "No!" The word was thin but absolute. Susan felt it like a plea and a command together. Lady Harthorn's eyes hardened. "Children do not decide household order." "He is not your household," Susan said. "He is not yours either." Ravensmere appeared in the doorway at that moment, shoulders filling the frame, coat changed but hair still damp at the temples. His presence dropped the room's temperature by degrees. "Miss MacDonald stays," he said. Lady Harthorn turned with practised surprise. "Your Grace, this is most irregular. My stepdaughter is tired and emotional. She requires correction, not indulgence." "Then you may correct someone else." He crossed to Edmund's bed and laid 2 fingers against the boy's pulse with a soldier's economy. Edmund did not release Susan's sleeve. Ravensmere saw that and said nothing, but something in his face tightened. Lady Harthorn lifted the folded paper from the tray and held it towards Susan. "Very well. Sign this now and be done. A simple account for insurance and road damages. You need only attest that the driver of that curricle was reckless and that the coachman from our household warned him twice." Susan took the paper. The handwriting was neat, legal in tone, and utterly false. It named the wrong horse. It shifted the sequence of impact. It placed blame on a hired man who would lose work, perhaps liberty, for an accident she had watched unfold. She set the paper back on the tray. "No!" Lady Harthorn's voice dropped. "Read more carefully." "I read perfectly well." "You will sign." "I will not." Ravensmere's gaze moved from one woman to the other, then to the paper, then back. "What is this?" Lady Harthorn gave a light laugh that did not reach her eyes. "A routine statement. She enjoys dramatics." Susan could feel her pulse at her throat. Fear twisted there, old and familiar, but principle sat deeper than fear and held. "It is a lie," she said. "The curricle horse shied when the freight wagon clipped its flank. No warning was given, no drunkenness, no reckless driving by that coachman. I will not send an innocent man to ruin so she may collect compensation." Lady Harthorn took one fast step toward her. "Ungrateful girl." Ravensmere stepped between them without visible haste. "Enough!" He held out his hand to Susan. "Give me the paper." She did. He read it in silence, then folded it once and passed it to the valet at his shoulder. "Mr. Kent," he said, voice flat as winter water, "find the toll clerk and take his statement tonight. Then take statements from every driver in the yard. Signed. Witnessed." Lady Harthorn paled. "Your Grace, this is absurd." "No," he said. "This is record." The word struck Susan with almost physical force. Record, not rumour, not rank, not the smooth lie that survived because it was expensive. She looked away before anyone could read too much in her face. Lady Harthorn gathered her skirts and dignity and withdrew with one daughter in tow, promising, in a hiss meant only for Susan, "You will regret this before morning." When the door shut, quiet settled over the chamber except for rain on the panes and Edmund's uneven breathing. Ravensmere stood very still, as if his body had remembered old pain and chosen not to move through it. Susan sat by the bed and dipped the cloth again. After a long moment he said, "You knew refusing her would cost you." "Yes." "You refused anyway." She kept her eyes on Edmund. "The cost to him would have been greater." Ravensmere looked toward the small connecting door to the parlour where firelight striped the floorboards. "I have seen men of title lie faster than you answered that paper. title does not improve arithmetic," she said. His mouth twitched once, not quite a smile. Edmund stirred and whispered, "Story!" Susan bent close. "What sort?" "The fox one. In Latin, if you please." She glanced at Ravensmere, expecting impatience. He only said, "He will stay awake if you keep him talking." So she began with the fable her father used to teach case endings to stubborn boys in winter. Vulpes et corvus, the fox and the crow, vanity paid for in cheese. Her accent was careful, old-school Scottish at the edges where she forgot to smooth it. Edmund's lips moved with hers on phrases he knew. When he faltered, she translated. When pain sharpened behind his eyes, she shifted to English and made the fox less clever, the crow less foolish, the ending kinder than the original. Night deepened. Travellers shouted once in the yard over a broken axle, then quieted. Somewhere downstairs a fiddle started and stopped after half a tune. Susan did not mark the hours by clock. She marked them by Edmund's pulse growing steadier under her fingers, by the intervals between his complaints lengthening, by his grip on her sleeve loosening from fear to trust. At one point he asked, half asleep, "Was my mother fond of stories too?" The question hit the room like a dropped glass. Susan froze. She had not known his mother was dead, but the silence from the doorway told her enough. She answered carefully, "I think she must have been, if she raised a boy who asks for them, while his head aches." Edmund considered this with grave effort, then nodded and drifted again. Susan rose to fetch fresh water from the sideboard in the parlour. The fire there had burned the low to red and ash. She paused at the threshold when she saw Ravensmere in the corridor beyond, just outside the half-open door, one shoulder against the panel, motionless in shadow as if he had been standing there for a long while listening. He had not entered, had not interrupted, had simply remained where he could hear the boy breathe and her voice carry the old Latin cadences into the dark. She moved to step back, but a floorboard gave a soft creak under her shoe. His head turned. For a breath they watched each other through the narrow gap and firelit smoke. "Does it hurt?" she asked before she could stop herself, eyes dropping to the fresh bandage at his shoulder. His expression altered by a fraction. The scar along his jaw pulled tight. He did not answer. Instead he said very quietly, "Stay with him." It was a command. It was also trust, and she recognized the difference. She returned to Edmund's bedside and resumed the story. Voice low, hands steady despite the ache in her wrists. In the corridor the Duke did not move, not when the inn settled into midnight hush, not when the rain eased to a thin, steady fall, not when Edmund finally slept with one small hand curled around Susan's bandaged fingers and would not release her even in dreams. In the narrow room, candlelight thinned and thickened with the draught under the door, and Susan kept speaking in a low, even voice while Edmund slept with his hand locked around hers. The fable had ended. She had moved to a psalm her father once used to calm frightened tenants during storms, then to simple facts of morning tasks, naming them as if order itself could stand guard at the bedside. Boiling water, clean linen, bread sliced against the grain so it held broth without breaking. In the corridor the Duke remained exactly where she had seen him, a dark stillness beyond the half-open panel. Her shoulders began to shake from fatigue she had denied all day. She tried to ease her fingers from Edmund's grasp. His hand tightened without waking. She stilled at once. The boy's breath stayed regular. Rain tapped the window in a patient rhythm. Somewhere below, a door closed, and voices dropped to murmurs. The Duke entered at last with no announcement. He moved like a man protecting an injury by instinct and refusing to acknowledge it. He stopped at the foot of the bed and looked first at Edmund, then at Susan's trapped hand, then at the untouched tray Lady Hawthorn had left. "You have not eaten," he said. "It can wait." "It has waited since yesterday." The certainty in his voice made her look up. "You cannot know that. I watched you in the yard. I watched you in the carriage. You gave him water first each time. You did not take a single swallow for yourself." Heat touched her face, not from shame alone. She disliked being read so clearly. "Observation is not entitlement, Your Grace." "No," he said, "it is responsibility when the first man in the room has failed to act." The words struck with the force of a confession spoken too plainly to be withdrawn. She held his gaze and saw no theatre in him, no polished pity offered for effect, only restraint pulled tight over anger, and beneath it a fatigue older than this road, this storm, this night. He picked up the spoon from the tray and set it in her free hand. "Eat!" She gave him a hard look. "You command everyone when you are afraid." His jaw set. Yes. The answer startled her more than denial would have done. She took one spoonful of cooled broth because argument would wake Edmund, because her hands had started to tremble again, because some part of her body made the decision while her pride lagged behind. The broth was thin and salted too heavily. It felt like warmth travelling through cracked stone. He waited until she swallowed twice more. Then he took the tray away and placed it on the side table with careful silence, as if sharp sounds might splinter the fragile peace around the child. A knock came, quick and restrained. The Duke opened the door before the second knock and spoke in a lowered voice, with Mr. Kent in the corridor. Susan could not hear every word, only fragments shaped by the inn's shifting draught. Toll clerk signed. 3 drivers concur. Lady Hawthorn's coachman contradicted himself twice. "Seal all of it." The Duke stepped back into the chamber with a packet of folded pages bound in twine and wax. Rain had spotted the outer sheet. He held it towards Susan, not close enough to disturb Edmund. "Witness statements," he said, "from the toll clerk and every driver still in the yard. They match your account. Mr. Kent has prepared copies for the magistrate at York and for my solicitor in London. Originals remain sealed. Physical proof, not rumour. Not polite dismissal. Proof gathered before midnight because he had ordered it done and men had obeyed." Susan looked at the packet as if it might burn through her skin. "You moved quickly," she said. "I moved late," he answered. "Quickly would have been 3 years ago." The room went very quiet after that. Edmund shifted, sighed and settled with his cheek turned towards Susan's sleeve. She could feel the warmth of his small hand through the bandage, and knew, with a clarity that hurt, how close he had come to silence in the yard. She also knew how many times truth had slipped away from her, because no one with rank chose to hold it in place. The Duke set the packet on the mantel, where she could see it from the chair, not hidden, not theatrically displayed, simply placed where it could not be denied. "I have issued one further instruction," he said. She did not like the tone. "To whom?" "To Lady Hawthorn. She is not to approach you without a witness present. Not in this inn. Not on the road tomorrow. If she attempts it, Mr. Kent will intervene and record the attempt." Anger rose before gratitude could take shape. "You had no right to arrange my movements without asking." He met the anger head on. "I had every right to prevent coercion under my roof for this night. This is not your roof. It is while my ward lies in this bed and my seal secures the ledger of what happened." There it was again. Commander's wall, not weapon. Protection delivered in the same register as possession. She hated how much relief it gave her. "You do not own the danger because you can name it," she said. "No," he said, voice lower, "but I can stop pretending not to see it." When the hall clock below struck 1, the inn seemed to exhale. Steps passed and receded. A stable door banged once in the yard and stayed shut. Susan tried again to ease her hand from Edmund's grip. This time the boy made a small sound of distress in his sleep and clung harder. She winced as the movement pulled her split knuckles against linen. The Duke came around to her side of the bed and crouched, careful of his bound shoulder. He did not touch her. He studied the angle of Edmund's wrist, then adjusted the blanket with his right hand so the boy's elbow relaxed. The grip loosened by a fraction. "Now," he said quietly. She slid 2 fingers free, then the rest of her hand. Pain flared where circulation returned. She bit it back. He rose too quickly, swayed almost imperceptibly, and caught the bedpost until his balance held. His face remained carved from control. "Your shoulder," she said. "It holds." "That is not the same as well." His eyes moved to hers. "You ask questions you do not permit others to ask you." Perhaps I learned from example. For the first time he almost smiled, and did not complete it. Perhaps. He drew the straight-back chair from the wall and placed it beside Edmund's bed, then stepped back, waiting. She understood after a moment. It was for her. She sat because her knees had started to throb with each heartbeat, and she no longer trusted herself standing. He took her vacated place near the footboard and remained there, one hand resting on the carved rail, as if touch alone anchored him to the room. "Why did you stay in the corridor?" she asked after a long silence. His answer came without ornament. "He asks for his mother when fever rises. If he sees me first, he grows quiet too quickly. I needed to hear whether his breathing changed while he listened to your voice." The admission exposed a wound he usually kept armoured in title and command. She felt the shift in him more than she understood it. A man accustomed to instant obedience standing outside a half-open door, afraid his presence would worsen a child's pain. That was not coldness. That was grief taught into discipline until discipline looked like ice. "You could have come in," she said. "I did, when you needed water." "You remained outside for hours." "Yes." He did not defend it. He did not ask praise for it. He simply stood there with the truth between them, and no shield but stillness. A second knock, softer this time. Mr. Kent entered at the Duke's nod and presented another folded paper. "Your Grace, a message from Lady Hawthorne. She requests immediate departure at dawn and asks that Miss MacDonald sign a household declaration before witnesses she will provide." The Duke did not unfold the paper. "Denied!" Kent inclined his head. "She will object." "She may object in writing to my solicitor." Kent glanced once towards Susan, respectful and direct. "Miss MacDonald, I have copied your refusal regarding the false accident statement in my own hand. If you wish, I will read it aloud for correction and obtain your signature now." The offer was procedural. It was also dignity, precise and practical. Susan nodded. "Read it." He did. Every line was clean. Time, place, sequence, names. No embellishment. No language to make her sound hysterical or grateful. She corrected one detail about the wagon's angle at impact. Kent amended it at once, sanded the ink, and held the page steady while she signed. Her hand shook on the final letter of her surname. She pressed harder and finished it anyway. Kent blotted, sealed, and withdrew with both statements and Lady Hawthorne's unopened message. The door shut. The latch clicked. The Duke looked at her signature drying on the duplicate left for her, and said, "Keep that copy on your person." "I have nowhere safe to keep anything in that household." "You are not returning to that household." The certainty in his voice was absolute. She stared at him. "You cannot decide that for me. I can decide this much. You will not travel back under Lady Hawthorne's control while evidence is active and testimony pending. At first light, you and Edmund ride in my carriage to London. Mr. Kent rides behind with the packet, 2 outriders ahead, no private stops, no unsupervised interviews. This is my order." She rose half out of the chair before dizziness pushed her back. "My reputation is already thin as paper. If I leave in your escort, she will say I planned this. She already says worse. She has drawing rooms to repeat it in. Then let her speak into rooms that will now hear an answer." He stepped closer, close enough that she saw exhaustion in the shadows beneath his eyes and the strain at the corners of his mouth where pain pulled. When he spoke again, his voice lowered. "Listen to me, Miss MacDonald. 3 years ago I accepted other men's judgment in place of my own, and called it prudence. I will not do it again. I have seen what they asked me not to see. I have heard what they called exaggeration. I have your account in writing and tonight's statements under seal. You are done being handled in corridors and ordered into lies. If society objects to the carriage you ride in tomorrow, society may object from a distance." The words left no room for retreat. Not his, not hers. Edmund stirred and whispered through sleep, "Do not go." Susan looked down at him, then back at the Duke. The old reflex said refuse all help bought with power. Another newer instinct said measure the terms, name the cost, choose with open eyes. "I will ride to London," she said slowly. "Not as a favour, as a witness." His nod was immediate. "As a witness! And no one speaks for me at any hearing without my consent." "Agreed. And no one touches my papers." "Agreed." Only then did she lean back into the chair, every muscle trembling from the release she had postponed too long. The Duke took one step away, as if giving her room was itself a discipline he forced upon his body. He moved to the doorway and resumed his post in the threshold, half shadow, half candlelight, keeping watch over the bed and the woman beside it as the rain thinned toward dawn. He didn't move again. He didn't move again until the first grey seam of dawn appeared at the window, and when Susan woke from a shallow, aching sleep in the chair, he was still in the doorway exactly as she had left him, coat buttoned to the throat, one hand resting on the lintel, eyes alert despite the night without rest. Edmund stirred first, blinking at the light, then groaned and touched the bandage at his head with cautious fingers. Susan caught his wrist gently. "No, leave it secure." He obeyed, looking from her to the Duke with a child's direct gravity. "Are we travelling?" Ravensmere crossed to the bed, his voice clipped but softer than she had yet heard from him. "After broth, after the surgeon examines you." The surgeon arrived within minutes, checked pupils, pulse, and the wound edge, then gave his judgment in practical terms. No skull fracture apparent. Rest required. Watch for fever. Keep him from jolting if possible. Ravensmere listened without interruption and ordered the carriage cushions doubled before the man had finished speaking. When Susan rose to gather the duplicate statement and tuck it into the inner seam of her bodice, Lady Hawthorne entered without waiting to be announced, lavender and ironed silk forcing itself into the small room like a declaration of ownership. Her smile was all teeth and training. "Miss MacDonald, a final paper before departure." She held out a folded sheet. "Only to clarify household expenses during this unfortunate delay." Mr. Kent appeared at once behind her shoulder, as if summoned by the scent of coercion itself. "Lady Hawthorne, you were informed. No private interview." He turned to Susan, not touching the paper. "Would you like it read aloud and entered as attempted contact?" Susan met Lady Hawthorne's gaze and felt, for the first time, no impulse to flinch. "Enter it." Kent took the sheet, read it in the open room, and recorded the line that mattered. Acknowledgement that Susan travelled voluntarily under correction and had no separate claim to family accounts. He sanded the ink, sealed his note, and stated the outcome in a clear clerk's voice. "Attempt logged at 6:42. Offered language rejected by Miss MacDonald in the presence of witnesses." Lady Hawthorne's mouth hardened. The loaded look she gave Susan promised punishment by habit. It promised nothing by law. 3 days later, London received them in a wet wind that smelled of coal smoke and the river. Ravensmere's townhouse drawing room had been cleared of gaming tables and arranged as a private hearing chamber. Magistrate at the long walnut table, solicitor beside him with tied bundles of papers, 2 guards at the rear doors, and half a ring of invited witnesses who had expected scandal and found procedure. Susan stood at the table's near end in a plain, dark dress Mrs. Davies had once mended for her, bandages replaced by clean linen at her wrists. Across from her, Lady Hawthorne sat in pearl-grey silk, daughters flanking her like mirrors of contempt. Mr. Kent laid out the sequence of evidence with deliberate, almost severe order. Toll clerk's statement, driver statements, Susan's signed refusal, coachman contradiction noted and witnessed. Then he paused and nodded to Ravensmere's solicitor, Mr. Ellery, who produced a small, dark, calf-bound book from a sealed satchel and placed it before the magistrate. Susan knew the worn corners before she saw the spine. Her hidden ledger, the one from the attic chest beneath her narrow bed. Her breath caught. Ravensmere did not look at her. He addressed the magistrate. "Upon Miss MacDonald's instruction, my man retrieved this ledger from MacDonald House attic room, East Eve, chest under linen. Retrieval witnessed by Mrs. Davies and Constable Pearce. Seal unbroken until this table." The magistrate checked the wax, nodded, and broke it himself. Pages turned, dates, transferred sums, duplicate entries, withheld wages marked as zeros. One line in small, controlled script, supper denied for walking too slowly. Lady Hawthorne rose before she was called. "Forgery. The girl has always copied hands. She mimics signatures for sport." Her daughter produced a sheaf of polished account pages and offered them with trembling triumph. Here, her thefts, her own totals. Mr. Ellery accepted the sheaf, compared paper stock, then held one page beneath the lamp. Different ink age, different pressure, signature traced over an earlier line. The magistrate requested Lady Hawthorne's writing sample from the previous quarter instruments already filed. It matched the altered debt releases in slant, loop, and distinctive break in the second H. Lady Hawthorne lunged across the table and grabbed for Susan's ledger with both hands. A guard caught her wrists before the book left the wood. Silence crashed down so hard that Susan heard only fire hiss and the wet tick of rain at the glass. The magistrate spoke each order as if cutting rope. Guardianship rights over Miss Susan MacDonald revoked. Control of MacDonald dowry instruments annulled. Altered debt filings referred for prosecution. Lady Hawthorne confined to her reduced dower property, pending further inquiry. No authority over Miss MacDonald's person, income, correspondence, or movement. The daughters were released to their maternal aunt's supervision. The forged sheaf was tagged and removed. Kent's log of attempted coercion was entered with the rest. Every physical paper named, sealed, and accounted for before witnesses. As the guards escorted Lady Hawthorne out, she turned once, fury stripped of polish. "You have ruined your own name." Susan answered with a steadiness that surprised even her. "No, I have written it." When the doors shut behind the guards, the room emptied quickly, scandal-seekers retreating once spectacle became law. Edmund, pale but upright, sat on a settee with a blanket over his knees and watched Susan with solemn approval, as if she had passed an examination he had expected all along. Mr. Ellery remained to complete transfer documents. He placed a signet ring on the table between Susan and Ravensmere, old gold worn smooth inside the band, MacDonald crest engraved deep enough to catch light. "Recovered from Lady Hawthorne's locked dispatch case," Ellery said. "Listed as estate property under Mr. Ian MacDonald. It is yours, Miss MacDonald." Susan touched the ring with 2 fingers before she dared lift it. The metal was warm from Ellery's hand and heavier than memory. Her father had turned that very seal against wax while she sanded pages at his elbow. For one suspended moment she could not speak. Ellery withdrew. Kent withdrew. Even Edmund, with a glance from the Duke, allowed the nurse to lead him toward the adjoining room for broth and rest. The drawing-room quieted until only rain and fire remained. Ravensmere stood opposite Susan with no audience left to impress, and no title left to hide behind. 3 years ago you asked for intervention. I chose convenience and called it judgment. He looked at the ledger, then at her face. Everyone told me you were beneath me. I believed them for 3 years too long, and I will spend the rest of my life proving I was wrong. He placed both hands flat on the table, as if refusing himself any gesture that might feel like pressure. Your estate is restored in your own legal name. Your accounts are yours. Your movement is yours. If you refuse me now, you leave with all of it untouched. If you choose me, it is choice only. She felt the old fear and the new trust collide so sharply it almost hurt. He had answered the question she asked at Blackthorn without saying it outright. Does it hurt? Yes. Enough to remake a man or leave him stone. Susan slid the signet onto her finger. It fit. Yes, she said, voice low but clear, but as your equal. By Michaelmas morning the announcement was read in St. Martin's Chapel after prayers, not as rescue, not as patronage, but as a marriage contract between Susan MacDonald of MacDonald House and Alistair Vale, Duke of Ravensmere, each retaining named properties and rights as separately held and jointly governed. There were murmurs, some sour, some startled, some openly pleased. Mrs. Davies cried without restraint in the second pew, and made no apology. Kent stood at the back with the composure of a man who trusted records more than gossip. That same afternoon, in the long-shut schoolroom at MacDonald House, sunlight fell across reopened desks while Edmund, fully recovered, restless, and very much alive, argued over a Latin declension with theatrical despair. Susan corrected him, then laughed when he accused her of cruelty in exactly the tone he had used in Blackthorn. Ravensmere stood in the doorway with his shoulder healed enough for ordinary movement, watching them both with that restrained stillness that had once read as ice and now read as devotion disciplined into action. Outside, workers carried out broken furniture and brought in ledgers, slates, and maps. The brass plate at the front entry had been replaced that morning. It read MacDonald House, and beneath it, in smaller letters newly engraved, School and Estate Office, Proprietor Susan MacDonald Vale. The hidden ledger, no longer hidden, rested in the front office cabinet beside the magistrate's order, the witness packet, and the recovered forged pages marked settled, each file tied, labelled, and closed. At dusk, when the last clerk had gone and the corridors no longer echoed with strangers, Susan stood in the old accounting room where her father had taught her columns by candlelight. Ravensmere came to stand beside her, not crowding, not claiming, simply present. She pressed her thumb over the signet's worn edge and looked out at the rain-washed courtyard that was hers again by law and by endurance. "Stay," she said. He answered with the first unguarded warmth she had ever heard in his voice. Always.